Broadcast of the North Idaho College Public Forum, a student production. Your moderator is North Idaho College political scientist Tony Stewart.
Good evening. It is a pleasure for me to welcome to our program Elvira Barlow. Mrs. Barlow, as to education, received a bachelor's degree from Humboldt State College and a master's degree from that same institution in the field of speech and hearing some years ago. She then went to Pennsylvania State University and did her doctorate in the field of education administration. At the present time, she is serving as on a one-year Rockefeller Foundation grant as administrative assistant to the president of North Idaho College. During her stay here, she has many responsibilities in relation to administration, but we've asked her to come on our program this evening to deal with a number of topics that we feel that you will have interest in as viewers. First of all, while at Penn State University, she was a counselor to the Black Studies program, and she was editor of Black at Penn State. She also worked very closely with American Native students at that institution. So this evening she will discuss, in response to questions, students on our campuses in this country today, and especially emphasize the attitude of Black and American Native students. Also, our guest has a great interest in the art and the crafts of American Natives, and in fact is involved in this field herself, and we'll discuss this, as well as general questions on education. Elvira, it's a great pleasure having you on our program.
Thank you very much, Tony.
I'm also happy to welcome to our program two visiting panel members who will join me in quizzing our guests. To my far left is Mr. Richard Snyder, who holds a bachelor's degree from California State University at Northridge in the field of anthropology and a master's degree in the same field from UCLA. He is a member of the faculty teaching anthropology at North Idaho College. Richard, welcome once again.
Thanks a lot, Tony. I'm glad to be back.
I also find it a pleasure to welcome to our program Ms. Peggy Fedge, who holds a bachelor's degree from the University of North Dakota and two master's degrees from Washington State University, one in the field of counseling and one in the field of foreign languages, and serves presently as a counselor at North Idaho College. And Peggy, it's a pleasure having you here.
Thank you, Tony.
We'll proceed to questions at once, and the first series of questions will come from Richard Snyder.
Mrs. Barlow, what trends do you see in the concerns of college students today? I'm thinking trends from the revolutionaries of the 1960s, perhaps culminating in 1968, and what seems to me somewhat docile college students today. Do you see any major trends taking place just in your own experiences?
Well, I like to think of that movement as sort of like a pendulum. For a long period of time, students really weren't being heard by faculty and by administration, and so there was a period of time where students felt it necessary, perhaps, to make a little noise or to be heard. And I think it's sort of a swing back that they've accomplished a lot of that now and do have a lot of input into what is being taught at universities and what kind of courses are offered and that kind of thing. And so right now it seems to be kind of a slowing down period. I don't see any major things happening right at this moment.
Well, what about the case of minorities on college campuses around the United States? Have conditions really improved for blacks and Chicanos and Native Americans and the Poles, whoever? Are conditions really significantly better than they were, say, in the early 60s, and everybody's calmed down for a while?
Well, they have improved to some degree, not as much as I'd like to have them improve. We're still looking, I think, some universities are still looking on a quota system, and that's unfortunate. We have a certain percentage of blacks, therefore we have maybe 10% blacks in our universities, or we have 1% Indians, and this meets our quota. I really think that that isn't the issue. I do see more minority students in colleges, and I think part of that has been a result of having financial aids. Universities are extremely expensive, and minority peoples many times don't have the finances. So when financial aids are made available to them, you will see more minority students in colleges and universities.
If I could just pursue this a little farther, you mentioned financial aid. I assume you primarily mean the federal government with this kind of grant or that kind of grant, supporting education, saying we are going to have some kind of a quota. You cannot discriminate by heritage or skin color or length of fingernails and so forth. What do you perceive as being the major emphasis of the United States government right now with educational money? Where are they channeling the money? Is it going just into getting students into school? Is it going to particular research projects? How do you see the government right now using education funds as those funds might relate to minorities?
I would like to just take a little piece of that question and answer it. I think I could answer it better from the Indian education point of view rather than the overall national scope right now in education. Of the approximately 350,000 students who are Indian students who are of school age right now, about 300,000 are attending public schools. And the BIA, which is the Bureau of Indian Affairs, has taken the responsibility in past years and is currently taking responsibility to see that Indian people are educated. And this includes people who are on the reservation who are too far from public schools to take advantage of it. But it is a current policy, anyway, to have all of those people, when possible, attend a public school, so that we are getting away from special monies for special, I guess, interest groups. We're going more back towards, I believe, equal monies for the student rather than special groups, even though there are special needs.
If I could go one step farther, I'm hogging an awful lot of time, I'm afraid. You said 300,000 out of, I believe you said 350,000 were in public education of some sort. It's my understanding that at least in a few places in the United States, Indian tribal councils have taken over BIA schools and are operating them themselves under Johnson O'Malley funds. Do you know about this? I'm just coming out of left field. And are they being successful? I visited one at the Northern Cheyenne Reservation in Montana. I think it's located at Lame Deer, but I may be wrong on which town it is.
We have some that are very successful right now. In fact, we have one here in North Idaho, DeSmit School, I believe is a tribally operated school. You don't always find that happening. There are a few around. It probably arises from something we call Indian self-determination, where the monies are available at a tribal level to make certain decisions on what kinds of things are necessary in education. And some of the tribes have successfully been able to do this. And DeSmit, I think, is one of the more successful schools.
Peggy Petchy.
I'm going to backtrack just a little bit. You spoke earlier that now students are having an opportunity to be heard more than they were, let's say, a decade ago. Now that they are being heard, what sorts of, how would you, I guess, profile a student? What kind of concerns does a typical, I suppose I'd have to limit it to college student, have now when we're looking at political attitudes, let's say some sort of social consciousness, those sorts of things? What are they saying that is being heard now?
Well, I think, again, I'm going to go first to the Indian student or the minority student, which may have a little bit of difference with everyone in general. I find it very, very hard to generalize, for one thing. I think that they are being interested in such things as how can they use their education in their own social setting, which may be minority students I'm referring to now. What can they take home with them, so to speak? Theory versus application. So we get into those kinds of things. Students are asking questions all over, I think, on how applicable, something is. And I think that is the biggest question, is how I can apply it. How can I use the information?
Following along in this line, how do you see ethnic studies fitting in? Black studies, Native American studies, where does this fit into this scheme?
Well, I'm in a program right now at Penn State, a doctoral program, and it's for Native Americans. And I've been working with the Black Studies program also at Penn State. Those programs are in addition to regular programs. A student is required not only to know the information that is in a particular program, such as education administration or psychology or whatever, but in addition to that, there are special classes, for instance, that pertain to what kind of special things will you encounter in the field. For instance, in education and in certain tribes, education is not accepted as one of those goals that we strive to, because it's in conflict with some of the religious education and also in conflict with some of the other forms of education within the tribe. So students, for instance, Indian students who are in higher education or in other fields have to be aware of the problems they're going to encounter when they go to work with their own native peoples. So, again, it's just being aware of the group that you're going to be working with.
Elvira, I have a very long and involved question. That's one of my weaknesses, but I don't know.
2 pages, Tom.
I don't know how to ask it otherwise. In some recent literature that I was reviewing, I found some statistics that were, for someone in education, very disturbing. In a recent study that has been done by a national organization, the proportion of 18 and 19-year-old middle-class males that are opting to go to college and are excited about higher education has dropped from a figure of 44% in 1969 to 33% as of this year, 1976. Caroline Bird, who has also been involved with this question and published a book recently, said that maybe as high as 30% of all college students who are in higher education today are very reluctant to be there. And Harold Howell II, who is the former United States Commissioner of Education, concurred with her work when he said, speaking of students, and I quote, "They go to college because they can't think of anything else to do. They go because their parents want them to, and sometimes go because their parents don't want them to. They go to find themselves, or to find a husband, or to get away from home, or to prove themselves to be independent," end of quote. All these people who are so-called specialists in their field are giving us some very great warning signs, I think, that there's a great, really, displeasure among college students of whether or not they should be there and what they should be doing. How are we in education going to handle this problem? Or have we tried to make education too universal? Or is the curriculum inappropriate to meet the needs? I think this requires us to give serious consideration to this discontent among students about whether to be there or not. I would like to get your reaction to this information.
I think the information is accurate from all that I know about students and what they have said to me and from what I've observed. Also, I have read some literature that backs up what you've said. There are several, first of all, I'd like to go back a little bit. Education takes a big part of one's life, whether it be some instances 2 years, 4 years, or 6 years. That involves a very large percentage of time spent in studying. Secondly, education for the most part, particularly at the university level, is very expensive. And I think students are weighing the amount of time and energy and money spent against what the outcome will be after the 2 years, the 4 years, or the 6 years spent in education. There was a time when a graduate with a BA was guaranteed a job. There was a time when every teacher had a job once they graduated. That has passed. We have an oversupply right now of many of our educated people. And so because of a lack of demand right now, a lot of people are really questioning, shall I spend that time knowing that when I've got my BA or got my MA or doctorate, will there be something available for me? Or must I then do another kind of skill afterwards? And I think that is the major reason why students right now are wondering whether they should be in education or not.
This brings up another question, that is, if we go back in history, especially to Plato, Aristotle, and Socrates in particular, that the concept at that time that the liberal arts in particular existed for other reasons too, other than just preparing one for an occupation, that is, the sake of learning for learning's sake, or the desire of knowledge. Is this a virtue to have? Are we losing that, or does that still have a role within higher education?
I see that taking place a lot at the community college level, and thank goodness for it. We have so many programs, really, for the community, interest programs, high interest programs, both in recreation and in drama in many places, and many of the arts that are satisfying that need for people to learn more about various areas and to express themselves no matter what age. And so I see that taking place a lot, and particularly, as I say, in community colleges.
May I ask one final question in this area? The studies that I have quoted to you, most of them are dealing with students at the university level, the four-year institution and graduate programs also. Your mentioning community colleges may reflect upon these statistics, and that is the community college hurting the university? Is there going to be a competition here for head counts, for funding purposes? Or will we find that the colleges of 2- and 4-year institutions will cooperate together? Since you are in administration, have you experienced any, since coming here in particular, friction or I know that community college growth has been very significant in recent years. How are the 4-year institutions taking this growth to your schools?
Well, some actually find it a threat. Others feel quite comfortable with it, depending on the number probably of undergraduate programs that a university has. Some universities are very happy and consider the community colleges as a feeder program to many of their degrees, and are very, very helpful. I think that it should be a joint relationship, if I can get into an ideal now, rather than a competition, because we certainly are not accomplishing anything in education if we are battling over that kind of thing. The 4-year institution also, I think, has to look a little bit more at their curriculum. They're offering some of the same courses that community colleges are at a much higher cost to the student. And so they may have to be looking more at their courses. There is kind of a competitiveness there, but I think it can be a positive thing.
Richard Snyder.
Mrs. Barlow, I have a 3-part question, and I cannot make up my mind which part is first and which is second and which is third. So I'm going to ask all 3 parts and answer them any way that seems to make logic to you. Number 1, you mentioned special programs for minorities. It seems to me that, at least in some parts of the country, taxpayers are starting to scream that education is costing too much of the tax dollar. They're having to put out too much money to support education. With that in light, why special programs? They have to be expensive. Special programs for minorities, a Native American study program, a black study program, Chicano study program, these special kinds of programs. Why have them? Secondly, what kinds of educational experiences are Native Americans looking for on the college level? What is it that they go to college for? Well, is it the same thing that we assume everyone goes to college for, or the same numbers of reasons? Do they want to go to college for specific reasons? I want to go to college to become a diesel mechanic, or I want to go to college to become a lawyer for my tribe, or just sort of general reasons. And thirdly, Is it possible in today's world for a Native American to get an adequate education in white public schools? Is it possible? And there's some defining that needs to be done. Adequate in the sense of adequate for the Native American. And it would sort of hinge on what Native Americans are looking for in a college education. Why do they go, and can they really get what they're looking for?
Okay, first of all, I'd like a clarification of your last question here. Is it possible for Native Americans to get an adequate education in public schools?
Right, public college or public high school.
You're not limiting that to elementary, secondary, or graduate schools?
No,
just
take
in
all three
public schools. Okay. Why have special programs for minorities? I would imagine there are as many answers to that as as there are people asking the question. There have been several times and several people have expressed the need for education for everyone. And during the Truman administration, that was brought out again, that there really needs to be education for everyone, that this is going to be a goal in America. And as a result of that, a number of community colleges sprung up, for instance, to meet that need of education for everyone who desires it. As you are aware, minorities have not always been a part or represented in the same proportion as other groups of people. There are a number of reasons probably for that. Some of them are quite obvious. Language barrier, I think, is a very large reason why some minority peoples have not been represented in education. Cost, again, the cost to live in another location, for instance. So there have been a number of reasons why minorities haven't been there. Why get them there is really your question. I suppose there are different reasons for different minorities. The federal government, for instance, has made a number of treaties with the Native American peoples which indicate that the federal government will provide, for instance, health services and will provide educational services for the Native American people. This is one big difference between grouping minorities with Indians with all other minorities, because this is the only people that I know of that have such treaties right now. So I believe that as far as the Native Americans are concerned, this is a carrying out of part of a treaty that has been made, or a number of treaties that have been made in the past, for the purchase of land and a number of items. This was part of the payment, so to speak, that we will educate and we will provide health services. For other peoples, I think it's a part of a conscience. For the black, for instance, and also for the Mexican Americans, is a part of an awakening of a conscience. If we really want to provide an education for peoples, let's find out what it is that it takes. Are we going to have to change some of our programs to have dual languages, for instance? Are we going to have to pay some tuitions to help those people to get here? So that it's a part of an awakening of the American conscience, I would say. The second question, what kinds of experiences are, I'll try to word it the way
Native
that you
Americans
did.
looking for
What kind are they
college?
looking for? I would think that they are looking for pretty much the same as anyone else is. They're looking to learn the tools by which positions are gained, and in addition, I think to that, though, that there is a very important reason for learning the tools, for learning how to be an educator, for learning how to be a lawyer, for learning how to be a doctor. For so many years, the Native American people have been directed by other people other than themselves, because they didn't have the people in courts. They didn't have the Native American people to represent them in courts. They didn't have their own doctors. And so all the decisions that were made by educated people were made by educated people other than Native Americans. And so I think there's a real trend now to say, let's educate some of our people, and we'll try and determine our own direction and purpose. And we'll learn the tools that are necessary and use those then to determine where we're going. The third question, is it possible for Native Americans to get an adequate education in public schools? That is a very, very broad question. And even the definition of Native Americans is, we could take up a whole hour if we wanted to get into that. I think it's based on where, for instance, that person lives. If they live within a setting that's very remote, it might be very difficult for them to get an education, particularly if they don't feel comfortable with leaving. If they're more in an urban setting, they may have more of a chance of getting an adequate education than in a remote setting. And again, this involves several things: the willingness to leave your home to go elsewhere for the education. And this doesn't necessarily just mean college-age students. It means sometimes that the child has to leave home and go to a boarding school at 6 or 7 years of age, leave his family for a week or even for a quarter. So it's a big sacrifice.
Peggy Fedge.
I'm going to try and pursue this a little bit more. When you're talking about children, probably first grade, it sounds like at 6 years old, leaving home possibly to go to school, can you comment on the quality of education that Native Americans are finding in public elementary schools? And how do you see the universities as fulfilling a need for instructors, for teachers? It's sort of a two-pronged question.
Okay. I can only speak for myself in this instance, how I see education today. Is that really the question? How do I see it? I see it differently on different levels, which even will complicate the answer a little more. I've had the opportunity to see how a number of states handle their education, and I've seen just some very excellent teachers. I have seen some very poor kinds of learning going on in the classroom, unfortunately. I would think that if I had to say one thing that a teacher could be to be effective with anyone is to be flexible, to allow for flexibility within the classroom, that not all people get there with the same background, with the same needs, with the same goals. And I guess that answer would apply to all the different levels.
Are our universities providing teachers, elementary and secondary, that are doing this? Do you think there's that emphasis in teacher training today?
I think there's more of an emphasis in that area than there has been in the past. It's not always reflected in the classroom. And that's where it really counts. The philosophy and the theory is there, but it's unfortunately not always reflected.
Elvira, I have a follow-up question to Peggy Fedge's last two. If you take Native American students who have grown up in a community that has, in particular, in that particular group, cherished their own cultural values, their own religion, their own language, and you place that student, that individual, in a public school system that is not appreciative of those values or does not have a particular curriculum that will allow a further expansion of the Native American culture, or in a college that will not do this, isn't there a great danger of a loss of that culture, or is it important to maintain that? I have observed in both readings and with the opportunity to interview several Native Americans in the last couple of years on this program, that there is a great appreciation, I sense, among younger Native Americans in wanting to maintain something that is very precious and has been here a long, long time. And they are beginning to resist the educational system that is an attempt to assimilate them into a culture that is not their own. How would you react to the statement that I've heard from so many Native Americans? And if that's the case, does one change the educational system to incorporate those values, or does one have an independent system? How can peoples who come from very different cultural values, different religious concepts, come into an education system together and yet not allow one culture to dominate the other cultures within that educational system?
It's a very involved question. I hope I have as long an answer for it, Tony. I think that you have to make an assumption here that all education is change. The reason why people attend any school is for change. All knowledge will change the way one thinks and the way one acts, or ultimately the way one acts. And so that any kind of education, as I said, has an effect, and that can be a real threat. This is true. It can be a real threat, particularly if it's in direct conflict with what one has already learned or hopes to be true or believes to be true. And I think we can get into a conflict here of information can be presented, and it's one system versus the system, for instance. If it could be taught that this is one system of determining what the weather patterns are, for instance, rather than this is the only system for determining when it's going to rain. Those kind of things, I think, would help. For instance, a Native American student particularly, I was thinking right now the Southwest, they have certain beliefs that they can tell when it's going to rain and when it's not by certain patterns, and to say that this is the only system that we have, it's this one, disregard something that they believe in. And it's a very hard choice sometimes for Indian people or for any people to have to make a decision on what is true. What shall I accept? It's a very difficult decision, and I think it's so difficult, in fact, that for some peoples they find they can no longer go on with education and will drop out if it's particularly against religious views.
Richard Snyder.
I think it's a well-known principle that it is highly desirable, even necessary, to have successful images for children to look up to help them visualize their own lives 20 years down the road, 25 years down the road. I know there's evidence to indicate that in the case of blacks living in ghettos, members of the ghetto that do make it somehow flee. They leave. They move to a successful part of town. They move to the kinds of life they want. Lawyers, a black that becomes a lawyer, we'll say, or a doctor, or an engineer, doesn't remain in the ghetto. He leaves. And the children growing up can't look down the block and see a doctor or see a lawyer. Isn't this also true on the reservation? And if it is, what kinds of effects does it have on Native Americans?
I think it's most important to have someone to look up to and to think of as a pattern. When I was growing up, I remember reading the same textbooks as everyone else did. I didn't know there were any Indian people who'd ever contributed anything in the way of philosophy or education or anything. I didn't know that. I didn't know there were any black people who'd ever contributed anything either, because those kinds of things were missing from the textbooks at that time. And because of it, I also remember very well that myself included, as well as this was an all-Indian school that I attended, really didn't identify with Indian as being a very positive kind of thing. Even in the movies, the cowboys and the Indians were always the bad guys. And so you've heard the joke, whenever we play cowboys and Indians, all of us Indian kids were all cowboys. For that reason. But going from that back to your question, I suppose. You mentioned about the people who were in the ghettos, the black people who had become professionals and had moved away and made that decision. There's a little bit difference, again, between Native Americans, Indian peoples, and other minority peoples. Now, I may be getting into a bit of a controversial issue when I make this statement, but I do believe that black people have more of a philosophy and more goals in line with the dominant culture than Native American peoples do. For instance, I would not be surprised if a black person were to run for the next president, for instance. I would not be surprised at all. I would not be surprised if it were a goal of the black people to have it 80% with degrees, college degrees. This has not always been true with Indian people. Their values and what they ascribe to as success are not the same necessarily. We have a group of Indian people who do feel education is the tool. It is the way to get things done. But we also have a very large block of Native American people who feel that education is not, because it trains a person against what they have been taught to believe from their own tribe or from their own group. So getting back to whether a person is successful or not, many times the educated Indian person cannot return to their reservation. They will not always be accepted. They will sometimes be suspect because of the new ideas and new thoughts they bring with them. So there really is a difference, which I think, between Indian people and what they hold as goals and those of some other minorities.
If I may, I think this leads into something else, that somehow lurking in the bushes underlying all of this is political power. And I'm curious, what kind of political force are or is American Indians in the United States today? Are they actually a political force, or are they pretty well just scattered everywhere, unorganized?
There has been an attempt for organization. We have the Congress of Native American Indians, we have the National Indian Education Association, and we have a number of other very well-known groups. There is an attempt at determining some of the ways that Indian people will go, or some of the directions that we will take. I suppose we need to get to some things really basic. There has been an assumption, I think, and maybe probably it isn't yours, that Native American people are pretty much the same, but they have never been. They have had different languages, different religions, and have never been a force which has been united because of the differences between them. And so this is an attempt now in the last few years to resolve those differences for a common purpose. They still do not have a tremendous amount of power, and I'm not sure. There still is also the question about, is power what we're looking for? There's still those kinds of questions that they're asking. They do have influence. How much influence Indian people really want changes. We do have, at certain times, we have activist groups of Indian people who do demand certain things. Those are in a very, very small proportion to the total number of people, Native American people.
I sort of would have suspected that. I know on election eve recently, I heard how all kinds of facets of the United States voted, even how left-handed Czechoslovakians voted, but I didn't hear anywhere in there anything about a Native American voting bloc of some sort. And if I can hog just a moment more, I believe in 1969, Deloria published his Custer Died for Your Sins, and shortly after, D. Brown published Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. As far as your knowledge goes, have these books, which have been quite popularly read by the American public, have they had any effect on Indian life, or do you perceive them as having any effect on the white life in the United States? Have they caused anything? Deloria's book claims to be an Indian manifesto, and D. Brown is saying, shame on you. Have these really done anything? They certainly sold a lot of copies of books.
They have. I think a lot of Indian people have read those books also and have identified with certain sections of them. They have also had an effect, I think, somewhat on the American people as far as supporting some of the programs, for instance, some of the special programs. Saying, I really wasn't aware. We've made the program available. No one has taken advantage of it. They must not be interested. And then seeing that there are some special some special needs of Indian people, and seeing what has taken place in the past, for instance, the reasons why maybe Indian people don't trust as much as people would like them to in some instances, have made it more of an attempt to back special programs, have been more accepting of special programs, have we have a number of people who are non-Indian who like to identify as being Indian, that Indian must be a special thing to be now as a result of that.
There are a lot of relatives of Cherokee princesses popping up again. That's been a classic.
Oh, usually.
Peggy Fetchy.
I'm going to change the subject. As a Native American and a woman and an administrator, you are certainly a member of a minority group. From your point of view, what do you see as the major problems in higher education today?
I don't know how to answer that, whether I should answer it as a woman, as a Native American, or as an educator, Peggy. For myself, I am going to have a bit of a problem serving as an administrator, I believe, if I were to be working with my own people, for instance. I would very much like to work with Native American people to see what I can do to help with the education and with their purposes, but this might be in conflict with the idea that the male is dominant, and I'm very aware of that. So as a personal kind of problem, it's going to be a little bit of a detriment to me, plus the fact that many administrators, unfortunately not here, feel a little uncomfortable with having women in higher administrative positions. I noticed recently that Spokane has made a vote for the vote of confidence for a lady, but this is still something that is changing quite slowly.
I would like to get into another area of Native Americans, and that is the question of art and crafts and this whole area. But I know that you've been very involved in this, and you have some of your work with you that we're going to show in a minute. But before we do that, I believe this whole field of the culture of Native Americans and designing some beautiful things has recently affected the market or the economy in the field of clothing. And as this one illustration that we've been talking here today about politics and education, all these areas, and whether or not Native Americans are really having the impact that they feel they deserve. But I believe in this area that certainly this year, 1976, has brought about a great appreciation, and maybe through that comes other progress too. Would you for a moment tell us what you know about the effect this has had in the clothing industry, for example?
Tony and I were talking about this just before the show. But as a result of Native American peoples feeling good about themselves now, and as other people identifying that Indians have really something to offer, looking at what they are offering, the clothing industry, particularly in New York, decided that this fall that most of their fashions were going to be incorporated into design. And I think we find that quite a bit evidenced in the stores. There are almost every sweater has some kind of a design on it, and also the patterns have been taken further. They're being used now in drapery materials. As I mentioned, clothing. I've even noticed that some of the stores have linens now printed, and rugs, carpeting, and that kind of thing, incorporating the beauty, really, of the Indian design. So right now it's very fashionable and very much on the market.
Also, college youth, I understand, are wearing many things that have really a trace to the Native American culture. It's become very fashionable. I'd like to take a little time now, if we may, to show some of your own work in the field, and maybe the most appropriate thing to do is to hand some of these to you and let you describe them, and the camera, I think, can pick those up also.
Okay. Tony didn't ask me, but I'll give him the information anyway, that I am Yurok Indian, and the Yurok people are from Northern California. They're most noted for their basketry. I have a very good example of a very old basket, by the way, that in fact it's a hat, and it's very, very decorated. Normally you will not find the baskets decorated, but this is decorated for ceremony. It was the hat that I used at my marriage. And you can see the very fine work in the hat. See if I can get the inside to show the inside to the camera, and the outside. The yellow, and I realized that this is in black and white, is porcupine quills, and the black is five-fingered or maidenhair fern. And this is a craft that is still done by my tribe. Thank goodness that a lot of the younger people now are finding out that they can continue the craft. It is not one that I do myself. I've tried it. It's very difficult, much harder than crocheting or knitting. So I will just bring an example rather than demonstrate it for you. We'll just put that right here. I was recently down to New Mexico, and I have found there's a real influence on Native American art from the college down there, the IAIA College, Indian Art Institute down in New Mexico. And they are currently doing a number of things with their designs. This particular one is a well-known design off of their pottery. And they're incorporating this design, in this instance, on a shell to be worn around the neck. And I have also seen the design incorporated into material for clothing. So this is one of the things that's happening down there. This is something that's currently being done in our tribe. It is a necklace to be worn around the neck. This particular one my mother made, and it's made out of porcupine quills again, and abalone, and a number of shells. It's to be worn around the neck. Men or women wear these. They're very, very decorative and very pretty. The item which Tony is handing me right now is a Kiowa Indian. And some people refer to this as an apple doll. It is made from an apple. It has been carved and dried, and this is the craft that I am doing. It is a Seneca craft, but I find that I enjoy it very much, and it's a little bit easier than weaving baskets for me. Could we have the other one too, Tony, please? This one is a Navajo and has been done in traditional Navajo dress. I bumped it a little bit today, and so I find that I'm losing a little bit of the turquoise. But the Seneca Indians made the dolls in the beginning as a toy for their children, and it was supposed to have incorporated the spirit of loose feet to make the desires of children come true. And the original apple doll had the feet or the legs joined here so that when you swung them, the feet would swing, and hence the term loose feet. But these are constructed a little bit differently, and I've done a number of these in various tribes, and tried to make them out of the materials that the original costumes were made out of.
Thank you very much. Richard Snyder.
I'm curious, and to a certain extent I may be giving somebody a plug. I understand there are several nationwide Indian newspapers, one of which, I hope I get the pronunciation right, Wasaja or Wasaja, we happen to subscribe to here at the college. Do you see nationwide Indian newspapers as being a unifying force? Are they really going to be of value to Native American peoples?
I think that that particular paper, and I'm not sure how it's pronounced either, Wasaya, I believe, produced in I think in San Francisco, that particular one. I think any communication is really a binding force, and there are several newspapers now that do print information nationwide, and it's one way Indian people have of contacting each other. I think it has really served a purpose.
Peggy Fetch.
I want to get back to the crafts. I find them fascinating. You have several beautiful things there. In our time of mass communication and everything seems to be available, so readily available everywhere. Many of these, well, I don't recall having seen any of them really on the market available for large-scale sale. Are there any problems inherent in making any of these things?
Yes, there are. As a result of a number of laws and regulations having to do with where one may gather the materials. For instance, one of the reasons why the baskets here for so long seemed to be dying out was the fact that it's very difficult to get materials. The materials that go into the making of a basket are gathered over a year period of time. And because many of the things, materials required, are now on government property, they're on timberlands belonging to private individuals, they're either fenced or they are at least have signs saying stay out. And for years, the Indian people have gathered the materials that they needed, and they just have a real lot of trouble. For instance, the yellow, which again you can't see on your screen, but the yellow comes from a moss at the 7,000-foot level of a mountain, usually on it's on a tree. For dyeing that, well, very few Indians really own property anymore at those higher levels. They're owned by timber companies and private and federal government. And so special permission many times is hard to get. And it's necessary to go and to gather those materials.
Can I ask one more question? Right. The dolls fascinate me. I find them so human and so lifelike. Can you tell us a little bit more about them?
Okay. There are not too many people making the apple dolls, and I call mine apple sculptures because they're not really dolls. I've tried to make them as close to people as I can. A few of the people, the Indian people, are making them with corn husks. So the body is made of corn husk. The bodies of these are made with quite modern materials. They have a wire frame, and then are wrapped with Dacron and then wrapped with nylon to get their form. And they can be bent in different shapes, I suppose, so you can sit on the table, but they can be bent to assume various poses. The feet are weighted so that some of them will stand. And it takes me approximately 40 hours to make one. And if I'm not aware of the particular tribe as to exact costuming, then there's an amount of research that goes into it also.
Richard Snyder.
If I've gotten anything out of this program so far, it sounds like being Native American is really neat. You're winning me over. It does sort of lead me into a question. What is Native American? And you said earlier that it would take a very long time. Can you give us a rough idea of what's Native American? Is it different for different tribes, or is there just one blanket definition? And secondly, are there any particular benefits that go with being Native American, other than being Native American? I mean, financial benefits, Some people believe that every Native American in the world gets a check from the government every month. What's this all about?
Okay, I suppose that the simplest definition to give you on that would be the federal government's definition for many of the programs. In order to be eligible for a number of programs, one must be at least 1/4 Indian, and that has to be proved by one's grandparents, this kind of thing, with documented proof. And this usually results in looking up numbers. Each person has a number, and being able to document it in that way, so that when we talk about Indians, we're usually talking about those people who are 1/4 or more Indian. Those are recognized as being Indian. As far as what are the advantages to being Indian?
Well, I was thinking of governmental
government. There are
of
some advantages living on a reservation, for instance, not having to pay personal property taxes if your land falls on the reservation. Many reservations have gained their hunting and fishing rights so that they're able to hunt or fish in the same manner that they were accustomed to, and that might mean dip nets or gill nets, or to hunt year-round in their own reservations. As far as monies, some Indian people do receive monies, but that usually has to do with the sale of particular lands, and the federal government acts in loco parentis, if it were, and will sell lands or control them, or a number of functions, and divide up monies from that in some instances.
Peggy Fedge.
My one final question is, you are a very talented lady. You not only have a family that you're taking care of, you're an administrator, you're an expert craftsperson. What do you have as your goal? You're going back, you already have or are about to receive a PhD, is that correct?
I'm working on one.
What do you have as your goal? What would you like to do when the PhD is all done? And what is your goal as a Native American woman?
I've thought of that, Peggy, quite a few times, and wondered just exactly how I would answer that. At this point, I'm not really sure. I'm going to be involved, I know that much. And just where that's going to be, I can't say right now, because it's looking down the road quite a ways, but I will be involved in education. I will be trying to make some changes and convince some people.
As our program comes to conclusion, I must say on your behalf, Elvira, you're already involved and you're contributing much to North Idaho College as Administrative Assistant to the President. We're all very aware and appreciative of that fact. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Tim.
I also thank the panel for their outstanding questions. And ladies and gentlemen, may I invite you to be with us again on Channel 7 next Saturday evening at 6 p.m. when again we'll be interviewing another personality of the United States. And until that time, good evening.
The North Idaho College Public Forum can be seen at this same time each week over this station. The preceding student production was brought to you by Videotape Recording.